welcome back to another Rush Duel video. Today we're going to be talking about the meta. Specifically, we have a new set coming out soon called Phoenix of the Roaring Flame, and we would like to predict where we think the new archetypes and decks coming in that set are going to sit and shake up the meta, just for a bit of fun. But first, we have to work out where everything in the meta is now to see where we think those new decks are going to be slotting in. We're going to be doing a little bit of a tier list just to work out where I personally feel the meta is right now. This will be obviously based on a little bit of tournament results, as well as the kind of Galaxy Cup results that we've been seeing, small kind of tournaments within Discord servers. Basically just my general feel and grasp of the meta as it stands right now. So we're going to start off with, I guess, Yugioh. Yugioh is a really interesting strategy. It is basically using the power of Yugioh to reduce your opponent's monster's attack to 0. It's a strong dragon deck. It's okay. It's not anything completely crazy, but it's decently strong. I think it's probably about a tier 3 deck. Again, relying on reducing your opponent's attack to 0 is still good, and it works really good in just about anything, because everything doesn't like having 0 attack, surprisingly. But I don't think it's particularly higher than tier 3. Next up, Yugioh. Again, Yugioh I think is also probably tier 3, just because it hasn't been seeing as good a results as its older brothers in the other C-sub maximums being Kraken and Poseidra. Yugioh is kind of its own deck, whereas the other two kind of are interchangeable. Yugioh has its own build with all these different trap cards because it wants to keep recycling its traps and using them to keep it protected as much as possible. Now, an Yugioh deck that gets going is really, really oppressive because it has the ability to basically say, oh, you can't destroy me with effects, you can't kill me by battle, I'm going to keep gaining life points. But it does have some weaknesses, such as getting decked out, and it does fall quite hard to like Magic Cylinder, because you can't run any other monsters alongside it, and it doesn't have the ability to turn off battle traps like its brothers. So this thing can just blast your opponent for like 4,000 damage, which is not ideal, but again, if it works and if it gets going, Yugioh, really, really oppressive, really, really powerful. Next up, we have Sea Serpent Midrange. Sea Serpent Midrange is a pretty cool deck. I think it's quite consistent, which makes it really good. It's extremely fun. It has been slipping a little bit as of late, but still, I think a very competitive deck. I think it's probably tier 2, just because this deck can set up its kind of win conditions a lot more easier than, let's say, the Yugioh, because Yugioh obviously needs to find those pieces. Sea Serpent Midrange doesn't really need to do that. It can just play the mid-range game, summon out a decent amount of monsters, keep decent advantage going, always be able to create a board out of not much, and take advantage of things like Grand Extreme, so still very solid deck. Next up, we have, everyone's favorite, the Stun deck. This is specifically going to be kind of the Sky Savior mixed with the Yami Ruler / Yami Tarasu kind of build. This is entirely designed to make it so your opponent cannot play the game. We stop our opponent's special summoning, we stop our opponent from playing spell cards, we stop our opponent from doing anything. This deck is very strong. It does turn off a lot of decks. The only real problem it has, other than the fact that everyone hates it, is that it doesn't deal with absolutely everything. Maximum decks can still hurt this deck quite badly. 7's Wonder Fusion decks can still beat down this deck if they are able to set up correctly. If this deck does get set up, there are very few ways to actually out it, but there are still ways nonetheless. And we haven't seen this deck actually getting any big tournament results lately, but I still think it is a tier 2 deck. Next up, Wind Warriors. So Wind Warriors is definitely going to be probably top of tier 2. Wind Warriors, or Music Maidens or Music Princess, is a really cool deck. It has the new 7's Wonder Fusion, which I believe is called Music Maidens Dance, something along those lines, which basically lets you fuse from the graveyard, but it has an extra restriction saying that you need to have a bunch of wind monsters in your graveyard as well, which does make it a bit more restrictive than 7's Wonder Fusion, and the monsters you summon are obviously not as good as 7's Geas or Chariot, but still a very strong deck. We've seen a couple of different variants of this. Some decks go pure Music Maidens, some decks kind of mix in a Sky Savior engine, which can be really, really good. This deck, though, is still great. Being able to just pull out fusion monsters from nowhere by using a kind of miracle fusion effect is really, really powerful. Being able to summon out a card that can wipe all of your opponent's back row, increase its own power, and then blast your opponent, also really good. And it has also some really good consistency tools. That's why I think this is definitely a very strong tier 2 deck. And again, tournament results, it's been performing. We have seen a lot of tops lately and tournament wins from the Music Maidens. Next up, we have a very interesting one. So this is Thunderbolt. Now, this specifically, I guess, is going to be the latest version of Thunderbolt, which is the kind of Seven's Wonder Fusion Thunderbolt list, which kind of plays a Psychic core, but also has a little bit of Thunder in there, and just works to kind of mill your deck, find all the pieces for your Seven's Wonder Fusion, use cards like the Creator, and get kind of a slower control variant of Seven's Wonder Fusion going. It's good. Obviously, it relies on Seven's Wonder Fusion, which is really, really powerful. But I would say this deck's probably in around tier 3. It hasn't been seeing a ton of tournament representation. Obviously, it has seen some, so let's not underestimate it. But it's not anything super spectacular. So I think tier 3 is about right. Next up, Machine Maximum. This deck has actually been winning some tournaments. The Machine Maximum, this varies what Machine Maximums they're playing. Whether it's Beast, whether it's Magnum Overlord, different builds will run different Maximum monsters, but they're all kind of grouped into the same deck. Again, it can be very, very powerful if it gets going. If it's able to get its game plan going, it can kind of OTK out of nowhere. Beast is a very strong control tool. So the only problem I have with this deck is, again, Maximum decks in general do feel a little bit off a lot of the time. It's like if their game plan goes well, they're off to the races. If it doesn't, they kind of fall by the wayside a little bit. So although I think it's a strong deck, I'm hesitant to put it in tier 2, but I think top of tier 3 is probably where it belongs. Next up, Light Machine. So this is specifically going to be Light Machine without Cyber Dragon. So this is kind of Machine mid-range. Rather than the Cyber Dragon build, which is kind of all about fusing into the Cyber Twin and the Cyber Rush, this is kind of Mirror Innovator mid-range, kind of where we're looking at. So it's still a good deck. It's decent. It's definitely at least a tier 3 deck. It's just fallen a little bit by the wayside because obviously Cyber Dragon is king now. Next up, we have Monarchs. Now, where do we put Monarchs? Monarchs, I think I'm a little bit hesitant to put them in tier 2. We'll probably put them quite high in tier 3. Monarchs are decent. Again, we haven't seen that translate really into many tournament wins, but they're very fun to play. They're still decently strong. They can out a lot of things. If anything, they just feel maybe a little bit too fair. They're not able to rip your opponent's board to shreds. They can pop the occasional card, but a lot of the time your opponent gets a lot of control over what they're popping. So it's a bit restrictive in that way, but still very strong. Oh, next up we have Pure Glass Aggro. Now this is probably going to be up here. Pure Glass Aggro is very, very strong. The basic strategy of the deck is we play something like Grand Extreme to cheat out our Pure Glass, then use its effect, change it to defense, or change it from defense to attack if we summoned it with Grand Extreme. Make a monster's attack up by 1,000. Ideally something that can attack twice. So people have been playing this with dual Coretals, they've been playing this with Dragius, they've been playing this with Mad Rare Aquila. Anything that can basically attack twice, give it piercing and a boost to get maximum value. Because if you attack twice, that 1,000 boost is basically a 2,000 boost. 2,000 damage is a lot. Pure Glass Aggro, again, is a very aggressive deck, as its name might suggest. Very, very powerful. And a lot of decks kind of want a little bit of time to set up, and this deck takes advantage of them and just likes to smash them in the face as hard as it possibly can. So very, very strong deck. And again, we've been seeing a lot of tournament results with this deck doing very well. Probably also one of the strongest individual monsters we have ever had. Pure Glass is fantastic. Next up, we have our good old friend Light Galaxy. Light Galaxy is very, very strong. It's been doing okay in tournaments. It has won several tournaments, just not overwhelmingly. It's doing decently. The ability to fuse using any Light Galaxy monsters is always going to be a plus. Being able to cheat out these giant guys that can boost their attack up by a crap ton, namely Eternal Galactica Oblivion, and having excellent consistency tools like Galactica Eve, make this deck really, really powerful. The deck doesn't really have any weaknesses, it's just maybe not doing things as unfairly as other decks such as Seven's Wonder Fusion, and because of that ends up feeling a little bit like a pale imitation of it, but still really, really fun, really, really strong. Next up, Dark Galaxy. So Dark Galaxy is another deck, which is definitely tier 2. It's very strong. A lot of people really like this deck. It's very, very fun to play as well, but it is less consistent than Light Galaxy, and that's why I'm putting it here. I think if everything goes Dark Galaxy's way, if their game plan goes off without a hitch, very, very strong. You get to play roulette a little bit with Cryosaur, which lets you mill the top 3 and then gain an attack for basically each monster that you mill. So if you get 3 monsters, you get to attack 3 times. If you get 1 monster, you get to attack 1 time. So again, it's very fun kind of RNG strategy, as well as the other boss monsters being very powerful, such as Requiem. But again, its consistency, I think, is what lets it down a little bit. Still very, very powerful, very strong tier 2 deck. Next up, Pure Sky Saviors. This is going to be in tier 3 somewhere. Sky Saviors, again, as a pure deck, is a little bit weaker. This deck typically is being used as an engine in other decks, such as the Sky Savior Stun and such as the Music Maiden Sky Savior, to kind of facilitate those other strategies. So Sky Savior on its own, a little bit underwhelming, but still decently strong, definitely still tier 3. Next up, we've got our Dragon. Dragon Fusion is a really strong deck. They're specifically looking like Red Boot and Bluetooth, not the normal Dragon Fusion. That's going to be a different deck. It has the ability to boost its own attack up by a lot. It has the ability to burn your opponent for some extra damage here and there, making it quite a strong aggressive deck. And it has the ability to mess with the opponent's graveyard, which can be very, very strong. A lot of decks at the moment do want to be using their graveyard quite a lot, so having kind of an inbuilt way as you're summoning your boss monster to mess with your opponent's graveyard can be seen as really, really good. And again, we've been seeing an okay amount of tournament results from this deck, so strong, decent tier 2 deck. Next up, we have Guildford OTK. So Guildford OTK, again, we're putting this into tier 2. It's good, again, when it gets going. This deck has had a lot of changes recently. As new cards come out, this deck gets stronger. Being able to attack all 3 of your opponent's monsters can be really good. Combining that with something like Pure Glass to give it that extra boost and make it, 3,500 attack with piercing that can attack 3 times is really good. It just turns out that if you set up correctly, you can just wipe your opponent out, and that's bonkers. Problem is, when that doesn't happen, your deck is just kind of a generic beatdown that doesn't do a lot. But I think this deck works more often than it doesn't, which is why we're putting it in tier 2. Still strong and can still take games off of any of these other decks. Next up, Psychic Fusion, another strong deck. We're going to pop this in tier 3. Hasn't had a ton of representation, but it's still very good, very strong. It does have a couple of minor weaknesses, like it sometimes struggles to get damage in, but this deck can be very explosive. It can pull out a lot of damage out of his arse very, very easily. And Psychic does have a lot of tools, such as Romance Pick, which make the deck work very well and make it very consistent. So still really strong deck. We're hoping to get some more Psychic support in the future, but for now, mid-tier 3 is kind of where I think this deck sits. Next up, we have Sea Serpent Maximum. So this is Poseidra and Kraken. So it's either or both combined. The deck basically works to try and turbo out the level 10 big boss monsters that can't be destroyed by effects, that turn off battle traps, and that have really unfair effects if they get going. Again, this deck is really, really oppressive, and kind of like Seven's Wonder Fusion, kind of warped the meta a little bit. Decks now had to be bringing cards in the main and side that can out a level 10, 4,000 attack monster that can't be destroyed by effects, which is why we saw things like Talismanic Seal Array see a lot more play. Now, a deck that commands respect from the community like that can't be any less than tier 2. It's really, really strong when it gets going. If it is winning, it is extremely oppressive. A lot of the time you're set like, I need to draw my few tech cards that deal with this, or I just can't do anything. Obviously, a lot of the decks that are higher tier than this do already have kind of outs built into it, but the downside to this deck is you will not always be able to find it. Even though the deck is built to turbo your maximums out, you will not always be able to do that. Sometimes your opponent will have like taxes to stop you from getting to your combo. They'll have other ways and floodgates to try and stop you from playing the game. And because of that, this deck can get hurt quite a lot, which is why I put it to the bottom of tier 2. Next up, Blast Tomat. So this is Worms. We're going to put this in Rogue. Worms, unfortunately, I've always really liked Worms. I love Worms so much. They are not seeing a lot of tournament representation, unfortunately. We did see the Pyro Worm build, which is probably the best version of this deck, but we've only seen limited kind of use with that. Maybe we say Pyro Worms is like tier 3, or maybe low tier 2, or probably almost certainly tier 3, but Blast Tomat on its own, or pure Worms, definitely Rogue. Can win games. With the ability to pop face down monsters that it now has, it does have a way to get your opponent's life points, and a way to out a lot of pesky things, so there is potential there for it to go higher, but I think Rogue is where it sits right now. Harpies. Harpies is definitely tier 1. This deck is crazy. It works around the meta quite well. Having level 5 and lower monsters means it does not get punished by something like 7's Geas, which does make it very favorable in a lot of those kind of games. Also, it does not lose to something like XQT, which want to mess with level 7 and higher monsters. We have seen probably the most or second most representation from Harpies, and it is winning a crap ton because the deck is very aggressive. It has multiple game plans. You can summon the maximum and try and kill your opponent with that, with lots of multi-attack piercing. You can just play kind of a mid-range strategy where you're just trying to swarm the board with 2100 attackers, boosting their attack as much as you can. It turns off combat traps, so it stops things like Magic Cylinder that most of the field is kind of running. So very, very powerful, very strong deck, definitely tier 1. Next up, Wind Psychics. This is more of the pure Wind Psychic rather than the fusion build. This deck, again, is very strong. It has decent boss monsters. It has a lot of 2500 attackers that can boost up their attack. It is a decent deck. The equip spells sometimes feel a little bit lackluster, but some of them are also really good. It would be wrong of me to call this deck bad, but at the same time, I don't think it's quite tier 3. I think it is Rogue. I think this deck, again, can take games off any of the decks above it. It's just not going to take them as often as they will be taking games off of it. Again, really, really strong deck. I also really, really do like the Wind Psychics. It's just a little bit too weak at the moment. Maybe if they get a little bit more support in the future. Next up, we have Dragon Fusion. So this is specifically going to be normal Dragon Fusion, or I guess 5-headed Dragon Turbo. Again, if you're able to summon the 5-headed dragon, it's really annoying to out. A big 5,000 monster that has built-in protection can be a pain in the arse. The problem is the deck you build around it a lot of the time is a bit weak. You'll have to be running normal monsters with this, and the core of the deck can feel a little bit unreliable. I do think this is... I'm hesitant to put this in Rogue. I think this might be tier 3, but for now we're going to put it in Rogue. It's definitely the best Rogue deck, I'll tell you that, but it might even be like a tier above it. But again, overall, haven't been seeing a ton of success from this deck, but it is definitely really strong. Next up, XQT. XQT is another good deck. This is actually a tough one to place, because XQE, as soon as Mad Rare Aquila came out, was kind of tossed to the side. A lot of people didn't want to play it anymore. Mad Rare Aquila destroys its monsters, gains a boost, and lets it attack over the other QTs, which did hurt it quite a lot. But recently, we have been seeing return to form from the XQEs. It might be because people have started leaning away from Mad Rare Aquila to try and fit more core cards for their own decks in, and therefore QT is able to come back. But again, you can just side deck the Mad Rare Aquila if you're not maining it, which can still just hurt this deck. But even so, XQT is extremely consistent a lot of the time. It can be extremely oppressive. There are very few decks that can build as strong as a board as it as easily as it does. So XQE still a really good pick. Next up, Dark Casters. Dark Casters is a weird one. It's either Rogue or tier 3. We're probably going to put it in tier 3. I don't know if I think it's better than Dragon Fusion, but we'll put it in tier 3 for now. So Dark Casters, again, decent deck. The only thing wrong with Dark Casters is it's now being overshadowed by 7's Wonder Fusion. Dark Casters obviously can run 7's Wonder Fusion. They're obviously going to focus more on Master of 7's Road. This deck basically is relying still on Dark Revelation. Dark Revelation being a very, very powerful trap that can, a lot of the time, blow a lot of people out. Having a in-archetype Mirror Force that you can run at 3 copies is pretty good. Unfortunately, a lot of decks now are running anti-trap and anti-battle traps, such as Sea Serpent Maximum doesn't really care about this. A lot of these other decks are going to be playing cards that stop combat traps, such as Mirage Dragon or Jinzo. So it does mean that the combat traps have been seeing a bit less popularity lately, which is why I think the Dark Casters are down in tier 3 for now. Next up, we have the old Pyros. I'm not sure exactly where I want to put Pyros, but I'll probably rearrange a lot of this at some point. But Pyros, really, really good. Really, really fun. Decently consistent, surprisingly. They have the ability to weaken your opponent's monsters, which is quite good. Fusion monsters are also really good. For example, the Chemicalized Salamander Fusion can pop all your opponent's back row and reduce your opponent's attack, which is completely insane. Get rid of any combat traps they might have, as well as weaken their boss monster by a ton of attack. It's just really, really good. As well as with Splame, they're able to fuse quite easily using cards from the graveyard. So just a really good archetype. They also have Methyl and Ethel, which can fuse into Melel, which is also just a really good card. You can bring back monsters from the graveyard as well as gain extra advantage by drawing cards. It's a really consistent, strong deck. So yeah, Pyro I think is really good. It's not unfair enough, I guess. A lot of the decks above it are doing things which are just ridiculous. And I think because of that, it's slipping down a little bit, but definitely still a strong deck. And again, just because a deck is in tier 3 does not make it a bad deck. I just want to emphasize that. Anything in tier 1, 2, and 3 are all great. Rogue is where we're maybe slipping a little bit, but still decent. Basically, I think Rush is in a format right now where there is a lot of very powerful decks that can definitely take wins off of any other deck. Next up, Aqua. Definitely going to be near the bottom of Rogue. I love Aqua. Aqua has always been one of my favorites, but it's a little bit too fair. We're just summoning out 2,500 attack monsters. We're drawing some cards here and there. We're gaining a bit of attack. We're reducing our opponent by a bit of attack. Nothing crazy going on, but still, it's consistent. It's decent. It scraps quite nicely. It's just when you're putting against like a tier 1 deck, it doesn't really stand much of a chance. Next up, Baseball. Baseball's probably going to sit somewhere in the middle of Rogue. Again, Baseball, not a bad deck. Can boost its attack to a crap ton. Can special summon quite a lot. Is decent deck. It's just, it's fallen behind a little bit. It's been power crept, I think, just a little bit. Again, Baseball, still a strong deck. Can still take games off these other decks. It's just, I think it's Rogue for now. So next up, Prime's deck of choice. Here we have Fiends or Royal Rebels. Royal Rebels are in an okay place. They got some new support with cards like Royal Rebels Echo, which does let them more easily summon out their monsters and trigger their effects, which is always going to be really good. The downside to this deck is they don't really have any good ways to inflict a lot of piercing. They don't have any good ways to deal with face down monsters, which means if you're able to just set a bunch of cards, this deck does fall off a little bit. But the deck is really, really cool. It's really, really fun. I think aesthetically as well, the deck's really, really fun. And again, this deck can still take wins off of the decks above it. It's just going to be a little bit less consistent than the decks above it. Next up, Plants. Plants are definitely going to be in here somewhere. Plants are in an okay spot, I guess. They're very much outdated. They very much need a revamp. The new plants that we've gotten have all been normal monsters, which has made it very kind of awkward to try and combine it with the older stuff, which means this deck is a few years old now, which is not ideal. But the fusion monsters you can make are okay. They have the ability to pop monsters, which is decent, but again, can struggle to deal with your opponent kind of blanking a bunch of defense monsters. They don't really have any multi-attack. They don't really get a ton of piercing. They just pop face-up monsters, which again is okay. It's just falling a little bit behind the rest of the curve at the moment. Next up, Dragon Casters. Now, this is probably going to be somewhere around here. So Dragon Casters is not Seven's Wonder Fusion. Dragon Casters is specifically, I guess, Seven's Wonder Fusion without the Seven's Wonder Fusion. It relies on things like Dragius. It can use things like Pure Glass to boost that Dragius and kind of work as a kind of pseudo Pure Glass aggro, but it is using the Spellcaster core to get good use out of Dark Revelation. So it's an interesting deck, and a deck as old as Rushdoll itself that just keeps getting updated. No matter what we do, this deck seems to just not want to go away, but still putting up tournament results and still doing decent. I don't think it's as good as a lot of these other decks, but still good solid deck. Next up, Celeb Rose. This is probably it's probably going to go somewhere around here. This might even be tier 3. But Celeb Rose is a strong deck, assuming everything goes right. The problem is Celeb Rose has the issue of being a mill deck that wants to fill up the graveyard to set up its plays. The issue with that is a lot of the other decks in the meta also want to do a similar thing, which means a lot of decks are maining or siding a lot of cards to mess with your graveyard. Celeb Rose does not play very well if you mess with their graveyard and get all of their combo pieces out of the graveyard so that they can't use them. But if the deck does get going, it is able to summon out its fusion monsters, it does get its equip spells going, it's very, very strong, it's just a little bit less consistent than maybe I'd like it to be higher than this. Next up, Good Stuff level 7 Axis. This is a weird one. This was pretty strong, probably like 3-4 months ago, and was putting up decent results, but I think it's just fallen a little bit by the wayside. This deck basically wants to use like Bluetooth and some other good generic level 7s to try and just destroy your opponent's boards, kind of out-aggress them. It's not a particularly interesting deck in my opinion, but it's definitely doing okay, so we're going to put it in tier 3. Next up, Beast Warriors, or I guess Martial Hounds. This deck's going to be bottom of Rogue. It's okay, I guess, but again, it's too fair. It's able to kind of swarm the board, but not in a meaningful way. It struggles to find like piercing or multi-attacks, so again, bottom of Rogue, but I thought I'd still mention it. Next up, Cyber Dragon. Definitely tier 1. Cyber Dragon is really, really strong. It can play its like kind of mid-range game, then it can pull an OTK out of nowhere by using like Power Bond into a Cyber Twin or a Cyber End. It's a very good deck, and again, it plays a lot of level 5s, so it can play under a lot of what a lot of the decks want to do, like XQT, like Seven's Gears. So it's a strong contender. It's been putting up some really good tournament results, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere anytime soon. So yeah, Cyber Dragon tier 1. Next up, Zombies. I think Zombies is tier 3. I'm not sure exactly where I want to put it, but Zombies is pretty cool. This deck plans to fill the graveyard as quickly as possible and make good use of Ghost Vicious and Shadow Ghoul. Ghost Vicious to bring back the Shadow Ghouls to be your main win condition of just having giant monsters with big attack. It's very fun, and again, still very competitive. It's just, I think, maybe not as good as a lot of the other decks on here, but still, again, can take games off of all these other decks. Next up, Cats. Oh, everyone loves Cats. Again, an archetype that has an in-archetype Mirror Force is always going to be decent. It's just, again, not putting up as good results as we'd like to see. A lot of the boss monsters in this deck are kind of a bit weak. Getting out the fusions can be really, really good. It's just getting to the fusions can be a bit of a problem, but still a strong, solid rogue deck. Next up, we have Transamu Road Rhynac. So this is kind of a mix-up of Seven's Wonder Fusion as well as Light Galaxy. It's fine, it's decent, it's okay. I think maybe putting it all the way down at the bottom of tier 3 is maybe a little bit too harsh, but the deck hasn't been performing as well as its other two brothers. Light Galaxy just seems a lot more consistent, and Seven's Wonder Fusion is a lot more oppressive and just kind of win the game on the spot, whereas this feels like it's kind of doing neither as well. So it's still decent deck, it can still win, it's just bottom of tier 3 for now. Next up, Seven's Wonder Fusion Turbo. So probably the most represented deck at the moment. Very, very powerful, very, very oppressive. I'm putting it as the second best deck, just because people have started playing decks like Cyber Dragon, like Harpy Ladies, which have okay matchups into it, specifically to deal with it. Now, as we go forward, we might see that change a little bit, but for now, we're going to leave Seven's Wonder Fusion as second best deck. Dragius, again, can just end games out of nowhere. Against almost every deck underneath it, it has a really, really strong matchup, which can make things very problematic. But again, still very, very powerful, very, very oppressive, tier 1 for sure. But last but not least, we have our, I guess, Gate Order representative. Gate Order, I think, is probably fine. We'll probably put it somewhere in tier 3. Again, it's a strong deck. It can get a little bit clunky. If the deck does what it's supposed to do and you find your gates, your orders, you're able to summon out all your level 7 normal monsters, it can be really, really good. But if it doesn't, it can get a bit shaky. So this is the list of decks that we have at the moment. Obviously, this isn't every single deck, but this is the ones that I kind of want to talk about, and this is most of the ones that we're seeing in the meta at the moment. Now, some things in here might want to change around a little bit, and obviously, you know, your opinion may vary, and if you, again, have any strong feelings or opinions of this tier list, feel free to chuck them in the comments below. I would love to know where you think these decks should get rearranged to. Obviously, some people, I think, might say that, for example, Light Galaxy or Dark Galaxy deserve to be higher. If you're one of the many, many Oki Abyss mains, you might want that bumped up to tier 1 even. But I just, you know, this is just my opinion, how I feel about this at the moment, based on my experience playing the game. Again, I would love to hear your opinions in the comments. Now we move on to our new archetypes, and archetypes that are getting kind of additional support. So first off, we have Gaia. Now, Gaia is a deck that I personally have had a ton of success with. It's very, very fun, but again, it hasn't really been tested in a tournament setting. I don't think this is going to suddenly be a tier 1 deck, but it does have a lot of very interesting tools. It does have the ability to attack directly, to pop a lot of back row, and to deal with your opponent's monsters on summon, which are all very, very powerful. So I think this is going to be a tier 2 deck. I want to say it's going to be at least as good as Guildford. It might shift a little bit, but this is where I'm placing it for now. I think it's going to be good enough to compete. I would hope to see it winning some tournaments, but maybe I'm being a bit naive there. We'll have to see how it goes. But I do think Gaia is destined for good things. Next up, we have Jointech Fusion. Jointech Fusion is going in potential. Jointech Fusion is a deck I have been testing thoroughly and have found very little success. I have not played against many good Jointech Fusion decks either that I felt have really kind of nailed the build. Maybe when we lab it out a bit more, we can find something a bit more stable, a bit more consistent. But right now, I'm seeing a lot of weak boss monsters, a lot of having to spin a lot of plates to not get much out of it. If you do get out the fusion, sure, the fusion's great, but you have to invest quite a lot into it. Having to have Power Bond or Fusion in the graveyard to use the effect of your boss monster to bring back Centipede and then be able to fuse them together is very restrictive, so you want to be having like a lot of mill cards. It just feels a bit off at the moment. I'm not sure what we're going to see with that, but again, we'll put it in potential. but I'm really not sure where that's going to go. Next up, the other Jointech Maximum. This is also going to go into potential. Jointech Maximum, I don't even know if this is really a whole deck. It's kind of just 9 bodies you can just put in any deck that can form a Maximum. It's, again, a little bit wonky because you ideally want to be playing this in a deck that just has a bunch of other level 7 monsters so that you can use its effect to shuffle 3 level 7 monsters from your graveyard into the deck, gain a shit ton of attack a bunch, and try and end the game that way. But again, running all of those level 7 monsters feels a bit wonky. If you're not playing just level 7 monsters with it, again, that feels a bit wonky because now you're not gaining much attack. It's in struggle street at the moment. That's why we're going to put it in potential. We're not writing it off right now as just being completely bad, but we don't have super high hopes for it. Next up, Secret Investigators. I think Secret Investigators is probably going to be somewhere around here. I think top of tier 3 is kind of where I see this deck going. It is a decent deck. It's okay. It's arguably even strong. It does struggle a little bit to deal with some threats. It does not have consistent access to piercing or multi-attacks. It does have access to it. Just again, it's not built into the boss monsters, which does make it feel a little bit wonky. It does have the ability to draw a lot of cards and to excavate, which is very, very good. And I think this deck is very strong. I just don't know if it's going to be kind of winning a lot of tournaments going forward. We'll have to wait and see. And then finally, Phoenix or Pyro Maximum. This is actually a really difficult one for me because I think it's a really good card. I think I want to say it's going to be somewhere bottom of tier 2. That is because, again, Maximum decks will always have the problem of if they don't get going, they struggle. This deck specifically does have all the tools I feel like it needs to beat any of these other decks, and I do think it can beat any of these other decks. It's just not as reliable as, say, a lot of these other decks in a lot of ways. It does still have a lot of consistency tools, and that's fantastic, but I feel like a lot of these other decks can do a lot more with a lot less, which is why I'm putting this bottom of tier 2. I still think it's going to be strong, and I hope to see it get some good tournament representation. In fact, I'd like to see all of these decks get some fantastic tournament representation, but we'll have to see going forward. So this is my prediction. This is where I think decks are going to end up, and we'll have to look after the sets come out, after some tournaments have happened, and see if I was right or not. But yeah, that was the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.